Unit 4, Daniel's 70 Weeks, Part 2, An Interpretation. We laid out the structure of Daniel's 70 Weeks prophecy in the previous unit, and we get it in these 4 verses of Daniel chapter 9. So verse 24 through 27 is where we find this amazing prophecy. Now what we're going to do first is we're going to put the final 2 on pause for later, and we're just going to focus on these first 2, verse 24 and verse 25. So let's look at them again. So verse 24 says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Now, even if we pause right there, who's the audience that Gabriel is speaking to when he's speaking to Daniel? He's talking about your people, the Jews, and your holy city, Jerusalem. So this is for the Jews. But what's interesting is this word weeks. Now, this is a important word to understand because weeks, this word here is actually the Hebrew word Shabuah, which means sevens. So what it's saying here is there are 77. So you could have a 7 of days, which we would call a week, but here it's actually years. And so what we have here is a week of years, not a week of days. So we have a week now is a 7-year period. So you've got 70 7-year periods. Well, how long is that? Well, that is 490 years. Okay, so you have this 490 years. So we've got total years that we're talking about here. So we remember from our structure, so we are now talking about 490 total years, and it's important to remember that this is not 490 consecutive years as we looked at from the structure, but we are talking about 490 years. So now if you remember, if we went to verse 25, this is where we have 69 of the 70 years mentioned, and this is amazing. Look what it says. He says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince." Now, there's another part that we're going to go to on the next slide, but let's look what it says here. There's 2 events that are mentioned. The first one is this command to restore and build Jerusalem, and the second one is Messiah the Prince. Now, these are both extremely important how they're worded and what they mean. But let's go on and let's finish the verse first. So you've got these 2 events, right? The command, and then you've got the Messiah. What it says is that there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street will be built again and the wall even in troublesome times. So we have a very clear time period right here, right? We have 7 weeks and 62. Well, what's that? That is 69 weeks. That's where we get this 69 of the 70 weeks taking place right here in verse 25. Well, how long is that? That's 483 years. Now, if we use the calendar that was used at the time, this is a 360-day calendar, not 365, we are actually able to calculate the exact amount of days. And the amount of days represented by this timeline in Daniel 9:25 is 173,880 days. Okay, well, that's interesting. So the question now is, well, where does this go on the timeline? Where does this period fall? Well, if we go back to our timeline, we know that Daniel's right here looking at right in the middle of the Babylonian captivity. And we also know that the next major event is right here, the return to the land. And we see this take place in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Esther also takes place during this time period. But there were 4 decrees to rebuild the city, because remember, it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And so now there are actually 4 different decrees to rebuild. So which one do we need? Which one do we use if we're going to calculate this amazing prophecy? Well, it's actually kind of simple because 3 of the 4 aren't going to count. They're not going to work for us because they were decrees given to rebuild the temple, not to rebuild the city. Only one fits the details, and that is this 4th one by Artaxerxes in 445 BC. And if you go back to the prophecy, it specifically says the command to restore and build Jerusalem. And it says even in the next verse that the street will be built again and the wall. So it's talking about the city. It's not talking about the temple. The first 3 were given to the temple, but this last one, and this last one only, is given to rebuild the city. And what's cool is that historically we know exactly when this was. So if we slide up on our timeline, we see Artaxerxes right there. If you look down, we even see the return of Nehemiah as well. And when did this happen? Well, this happened in 445 BC. In fact, we know that this actually happened on March 14th, 445 BC. And if you use the Jewish calendar, it's the 1st of Nisan in 445 BC. So just curiously, if we take this verse, we take this date, not this verse, we take this date and we use the timeline given to us by Gabriel, if that day amount of days is actually correct, what is 173,880 days from this date? Where does it take us? Remember, it was from the command to Messiah the Prince. Well, if we slide down our timeline, this amount of days, what do we get? Well, let's look. So if we go 173,880 days, we arrive right here at Nisan 10, 33 AD, which is an interesting date because if you go back to the prophecy, look at what it says. It says, "Know therefore and understand, from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem," we know when that was the one given by Artaxerxes, "until Messiah the Prince." Now, this is a very important term. Again, knowing the Hebrew is going to really help us because this phrase is Mashiach Nagid. And what it means is Messiah, the ruler or the leader. So if we pause for a second, then we ask ourselves this question. We know that Jesus claims to be the Messiah, but did Jesus ever specifically present himself as the Messiah King? And we get this detail from one of our minor prophets, Zechariah. In Zechariah 9:9, it says this, "Shout, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." Well, this is an important detail because there's this interesting day in the life of Jesus that we see in Luke 19, where it says this, "And it came to pass when he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, and the mountain called Olivet, that he sent two of his disciples, saying, Go into the village opposite you, where you'll find a colt tied, which no one has ever sat. Loose it and bring it here." So they went and they brought it to Jesus, and they threw their own clothes, and they put Jesus on there. And what did they do? They went, and many spread their clothes on the road. So now he's going from Bethany into Jerusalem, and this is the month of Nisan, which is during the Passover celebration. So Jerusalem was packed with people. Look what happens. As he was drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen. And they said, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Now, if we pause here, what's going on? Well, they are actually declaring him to be the king. And the way that we know that is because the Pharisees get upset. And anytime the Pharisees get upset, we always want to watch, because look at what happens in the next verse. "And some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd, saying, Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Well, what's the problem? The problem is they're declaring him to be the Messiah King, and the Pharisees don't like it. Now look at Jesus' response. "But he answered and he said to them, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out." So it's as though there was an urgency, there was a necessity for Jesus on this day to be treated this way. Why? Why so specific? Well, what's interesting is the very next verse. Look at what Jesus says. It says, "Now as he drew near to the city, he saw the city and he wept over it. And he said this, if you had known, even you, especially in what? In this your day, the things that make for your peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes." What a verse. It's as though Jesus was expecting them to understand Daniel's prophecy, as if then to say that today was the day, based on what the angel Gabriel told to Daniel, you should have been ready. And if we, of course, know that 33 AD is the very end of the life of Jesus the Messiah. And it is this amazing prophecy that we are able to look historically, and we're able to see that the exact day was prophesied ahead of time of when the Messiah was going to be presented to Jerusalem. And that is how it gives us a glimpse into why Jesus was so sad that they were supposed to know this and they were supposed to get it. So much more we could say, but that's looking at Daniel, right? And so he is the final of our four major prophets. We are now through the end of the Babylonian captivity, and now the 70 years in Babylon are complete. And what happens? It's time to come home. So in Unit 5, we are going to look at our 11th major event of the nation of Israel, the return to the land.